In January 2024, history was made when Noland Arbaugh became the first person to receive a Neuralink brain implant, becoming the first Neuralink cyborg. Yes, you heard that right. But just weeks after the procedure, an unexpected setback threatened to derail Neuralink's progress. The implant's connective threads, vital for communication with the brain, started to retract. This unforeseen complication had not been observed during extensive animal trials.
So basically, there are 64 threads implanted in my brain, with 16 electrodes on them each. And over the course of a month, we saw a lot of the threads start retracting from my brain. So we were getting less signals from a lot of them. The data that we have that shows that they were moving or coming out of the brain was literally just whether or not the electrodes on the threads were sending signals anymore, if they were picking up neuron spikes. Some of the reason that happened, at least we think, is because the brain moves more than they thought it would, which is something that was so bizarre to me when I first heard that. I was like, you guys don't know how much the brain moves? They thought that it moved, like pulses, at about a 1 millimeter rate. So that's how much it'll pulse, like move, is 1 millimeter. And they found in my brain that it was moving 3 millimeters pulsing. So that's on a scale of 3x times what they had made the whole Neuralink and the threads and everything for, to be able to withstand. So they think that might have had something to do with it as well.
Undeterred, Neuralink is already working on a solution. In their latest conference, Neuralink revealed how their upcoming second-generation implant will address this and other challenges, setting it apart from the first. Please like and subscribe, and let's break down the key points from Neuralink's own words.
So we want to mitigate any of the problems that led to that situation. The brain is a fascinating organ. I'll share with you some of the secrets about the brain. During any typical brain surgery, a small amount of air is introduced into the skull. That's because neurosurgeons like to have as much room as possible around the brain. And so there's this little known control mechanism of allowing the concentration in the blood to rise a bit, which allows the brain to either expand or contract depending on where you target that CO2. But typically neurosurgeons will have the brain shrink by lowering CO2. What we're going to do in our future surgeries is keep the CO2 concentration actually quite normal, maybe even slightly elevated. And that'll allow the brain to stay its normal size and shape during surgery. That should eliminate this air pocket that we saw in the first participant. That air pocket, we think, may have contributed to eating up some of the thread slack as the air bubble migrated to be under the implant, push the brain away from the implant. And so that's easy enough to fix. Another consideration that we want to focus on for our upcoming participants is that the brain, think of it like a really complex folded onion. It's layer upon layer of sheets of neurons all over the surface of the brain, folded into this odd-looking shape. The folds of the brain travel down deep into the brain, and along with it go those onion layers of neurons. And if we insert very close to one of the folds where there may be very useful information encoded in neurons, we may end up traveling with our threads parallel to some of the layers of neurons that we're most interested in, avoiding them entirely. To avoid that possibility, we're going to insert in our future participants more close to the middle of the apex of the folds, ensuring that we're crossing the layers of interest, layer 5 of the cortex.
I also think that it's important to highlight here those tiny wires that Elon mentioned. They're a fraction of a human hair. They're very flexible, intentionally so, because the brain's constantly moving and you want the electrodes to be moving with the brain, causing less of the scarring. And it's actually impossible for a human, however talented Matthew is, to actually maneuver them. We have a surgical robot that we built that can actually precisely target them in any three-dimensional space, X, Y, as well as Z, with micron level precision, while avoiding vasculature so that you don't disrupt and cause immune response from happening. We actually have the technology to be able to place them exactly where we want them.
Yeah, it was truly amazing to see the surface of the brain after the robot had inserted all the electrodes on the first participant without a drop of blood in sight. Is really quite an achievement. Another of the risk mitigations we're looking at in the future is that the implant has a certain size. The depth of the bottom of the implant is actually thinner than the average human skull. And so what we want to be able to do is control the size of the gap under the implant, give the threads that travel from the implant into the brain as much slack as possible. We didn't do this in the first participant because we didn't want to manipulate any of their tissue that we didn't absolutely have to. In upcoming implants, Our plan is to sculpt the surface of the skull very intentionally to minimize the gap under the implant such that the bottom of the implant travels perfectly flush with the normal contour of the inner side of the skull. That will put the implant closer to the brain. It will eliminate some of the tension on the threads, and we think it will reduce some of the tendency of threads to retract.
And we actually built a tool to do.
Yeah, this is a very important detail. You really want the inner contour of the skull to be flush, so the implant, the brain doesn't want to pucker up into the gap. That's really quite a big deal. Minimizing the air pocket and the implant being flush with the inside contour of the skull are two very important.
The additional benefit here is that you do see some amount of stick up, what we call stick up, so you minor bump in the head, but this actually eliminates that even further.
Yes, really our goal is that if you run your hand over the top of the skull, you don't feel any bump, you don't feel any device. And that even if someone was bald, you wouldn't really even notice it. And then from the inner contour of the skull, the brain, from a physical standpoint, doesn't really notice that there's a divot in the skull because there's no divot.
Okay, another aspect of the human brain that obviously differs from any of the animals that we tested in is that the human brain is a lot bigger. And so you may not realize that means the human brain moves quite a bit more than any of these other smaller brained creatures. And so when we open the skull, we see the brain travel toward and away from the robot about 3 millimeters in total as the heart beats and the breathing takes place. And so that movement, it adds a small challenge for the robot in precisely choosing a depth to insert each thread. It's not an enormous challenge, and we've already upgraded the robot's capabilities to be able to even more precisely target depth in even a very rapidly moving brain with a high amplitude of movement. You may think the most obvious mitigation for threads that pulled out of the brain is to insert them deeper. We think so too. And so we're going to broaden the range of depths at which we insert threads. For the very first participant, we had an enormous amount of data from our animal work, and we had very highly optimized our insertion depth to maximize the crossing of the layers of interest in the cortex with the electrodes that we're recording from. Now that we know retraction is a possibility, we're going to insert at a variety of depths that even in several cases of differing amounts of retracting threads, we're going to have electrodes at the proper depth. And with the deepest threads, be able to track how much retraction has occurred across the surface of the brain from each thread. And so we're going to both have more threads in the right layer and have better data on how much retraction has occurred.
If you're a BCI nerd, you might know that being able to control individual Z depth per thread is not something that most neural interface devices offer. Most neural interface devices are a static, fixed, rigid array that you push in and all the electrodes are on depth. To be able to do this is actually pretty novel part of the robot.
Yeah, the historical approach is to actually pound in a sort of bed of nails with an air hammer into the brain.
Well, crazy. Just not a camera. This is. It sounds somewhat barbaric. This is not what we do, but this is what's been done before. Is literally just hammering in what looks like a bed of nails into the brain, which actually works. It's astonishing that it actually works.
And some people have manual, like DBS probes, you're just sticking in by hand. Neurosurgeons just guiding them in.
Those are several orders of magnitude more volume of brain tissue that you're destroying compared to what we're doing.
But that deep brain simulation stuff does actually work. It actually helps people a lot.
Yeah. That's a great product.
But I think we'll be able to do a much more finessed version of that down the road. It's really difficult. The Neuralink device is something that really absolutely minimizes damage to the brain, absolutely minimizes the load on the patient, and the goal is to allow someone to live a completely normal life. You won't even notice that someone even has the device. So, like I said, the ability to control your computer and phone, that's our telepathy, and then next device being able to allow people to see that could not see before. And in fact, you could allow people to see Geordi LaForge in Star Trek in whatever.
Infrared.
Yeah, infrared, ultraviolet, radar. So I think another way of saying it is that we want to give people superpowers. So it's not just that we're restoring your prior brain functionality, but that you actually have functionality far greater than a normal human. That's a super big deal. It's very exciting, and I think that should give hope to a lot of people in the world that the future is going to be exciting and inspiring.